They tried to take my entire house. Over $75. Yeah, you heard me right. $75. One measly fine for a holiday decoration that lingered too long, and suddenly, I was public enemy number one in the eyes of our beloved HOA president Karen. She strutted around with her foreclosure papers like she'd just conquered Rome, smirking as if my life's work was nothing but a trophy for her collection. But what Karen didn't know, what made her little power trip the biggest mistake of her life, was that my dad isn't just any lawyer. He's the guy lawyers whisper about when they don't want to be sued into dust. The kind of man who makes entire boards tremble just by stepping into a courtroom. Karen thought she had me cornered, but she was about to find out what happens when you poke the wrong family. Before I dive into this story of petty fines, courtroom fireworks, and sweet revenge, drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. If you had told me years ago that my biggest battle in life wouldn't be over work, deadlines, family disagreements, or even medical scares, but over a piece of lawn grass and a plastic Santa Claus, I would have laughed you out of the room. Yet here we are. That's the thing about HOAs. They lure you in with talk of community standards and neighborhood pride, but in reality they're often little kingdoms run by self-appointed monarchs who love nothing more than flexing their power. When I first bought my home, it was supposed to be my safe haven. A quiet street, well-kept yards, kids riding bikes in the cul-de-sac, and the smell of barbecues drifting through summer evenings. It was, at least on paper, the American dream. The HOA brochures promised order, harmony, and a neighborhood that would hold its value. At first, I didn't think much of it. I paid my dues, waved at neighbors, and figured the HOA would leave me alone as long as I kept things reasonable. That was before Karen arrived. Karen wasn't born into the neighborhood. She descended into it like a general marching onto a battlefield. The first time I saw her, she was striding across the street in a bright red blazer, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose lips, pursed so tightly it looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. I remember thinking, who wears business attire to check their mail? But that was Karen. Every move screamed authority, even when she had none. It didn't take long before she clawed her way into the HOA board, and once she got a taste of power, she ran for president. The old board was tired, complacent, and frankly relieved to hand the reins over to someone with energy. They had no idea that energy meant a ruthless obsession with control. From day one, she turned the HOA into her personal empire. Rules that had been quietly ignored for years were suddenly enforced with an iron fist. Trash cans had to be hidden precisely within 30 minutes of collection, or you'd get a warning letter. Grass longer than 2 inches, fine. A shade of mailbox paint not matching the approved HOA palette, fine. A bicycle left leaning against the garage overnight, fine. And heaven forbid you plant flowers that weren't neighborhood appropriate. Now, I'm not one to stir the pot. I like to think I keep my head down and my property clean. But with Karen, it wasn't about cleanliness, it was about compliance. She thrived on finding tiny infractions, blowing them out of proportion, and then parading her authority like she was the sheriff of some dusty frontier town. It didn't take long before the neighborhood grew divided. Some folks feared her and tried to stay invisible, keeping their lawns manicured like golf courses just to avoid her clipboard. Others grumbled quietly, muttering under their breath when they got hit with fines, but paying them anyway to avoid the headache. And then there were a few like me too, stubborn to bow down to a petty tyrant but not yet willing to throw gasoline on the fire. I'll admit, part of me found her antics darkly amusing at first. It was like living in a sitcom where the villain wore pearls and carried a binder full of violation codes. My wife used to joke, "Careful, don't breathe too loud after 10 p.m., or Karen will fine you for noise pollution." We laughed, but deep down I knew the laughter couldn't last forever. One chilly December, after the Christmas rush, I left my decorations up a little longer than usual. Life had been hectic work, deadlines piled up, my youngest was sick, and frankly I was too tired to climb onto the roof to wrestle down a plastic reindeer. Neighbors didn't care. In fact, some still had their lights twinkling in solidarity. But to Karen, it was an opportunity. I'll never forget the knock on my door. Not a polite knock, but a sharp, angry rap that made it sound like the police were outside. I opened it, and there she was in her signature blazer, clipboard clutched like a weapon. She didn't even say hello. She just shoved a paper at me and said, "You're in violation. Decorations must be removed by January 10th. It's January 12th. That'll be a $75 fine." I blinked at her. $75. For a reindeer, not just a reindeer, she snapped. Non-compliance. If we let you slide, others will think the rules don't matter. I bit my tongue to keep from laughing. But I figured, fine, I'll pay it later when things calm down. What's $75 in the grand scheme of things? I had bigger fish to fry that week. Only I forgot. And in Karen's world, forgetting isn't just a mistake, it's an act of war. From that day on, I noticed her circling my house more often, driving slowly past in her SUV sunglasses, flashing jotting notes. Neighbors whispered that she was out to make an example of me. Me, the guy who dared to leave Rudolph shining a little too long. It was absurd. But absurdity was Karen's weapon of choice. She didn't need a reason, she just needed a target. And I had painted a bullseye on my own back without even realizing it. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The HOA under Karen wasn't about $75. It wasn't about decorations, trash cans, or lawn height. It was about control. And once she decided you were an enemy, she would use every clause, every technicality, every ounce of her imagined power to crush you. At the time, though, I shrugged it off. I thought, what's the worst she can do? Little did I know that $75 fine would snowball into the fight of my life and nearly cost me the roof over my head. It started with a piece of paper. One tiny slip of paper that looked so harmless when I first crumpled it into my pocket. $75. Barely enough to cover a dinner out with the family. Not enough to dent my paycheck. Not enough to matter, at least that's what I thought. But if you've ever lived under the iron thumb of a petty HOA president, you know money is never the point. It's about power. And Karen had just found her first crack to wedge the crowbar into my life. I'll admit it, I forgot to pay. Life was chaos at the time. I was juggling long hours at work, my youngest was battling a nasty flu, and every spare second was spent running between pharmacies, doctors' offices, and my desk. Somewhere in that storm, the fine notice disappeared beneath a pile of bills, grocery receipts, and half-finished school permission slips. Out of sight, out of mind. Most reasonable people would have let it slide or at least sent a polite reminder. Not Karen. She treated that missed payment like a personal insult. The first reminder letter arrived 2 weeks later. It wasn't even written in plain English. It was drafted like some medieval proclamation, notice of continued violation, immediate remittance required. You'd think I'd burn down the clubhouse the way she worded it. Still, I shrugged it off. I figured I'd pay it next payday and that would be the end of it. But Karen doesn't do end of it. Next came the phone calls. First to my wife, then to me, then bizarrely even to my workplace. Imagine explaining to your boss that your HOA president was leaving messages about a $75 Christmas decoration fine. My boss laughed, but I could hear the raised eyebrow in his voice. You'd better take care of that before she sues you or something. If only he knew how close that joke was to reality. Then came the letters, certified this time, complete with bold red stamps screaming urgent across the envelope. The language escalated too. Failure to remit will result in further legal action. Non-compliance will be reported. Foreclosure proceedings may be initiated. Foreclosure. Over a plastic reindeer. When I showed the letter to my neighbor Jim, he nearly spit out his coffee. She's bluffing, he said. They can't foreclose over $75. Wanna bet he muttered. Because I'd seen the look in Karen's eyes. That cold, gleeful spark she got when she realized she had leverage. This wasn't about my money. It was about her proving she could take me down the way a cat toys with a mouse before going in for the kill. Still, I wasn't worried. Not really. I figured worst case I'd pay up late and maybe eat a stern lecture at the next HOA meeting. I didn't realize she had already shifted into overdrive behind the scenes. One evening, I got home from work to find my wife pale and furious. She shoved a stack of envelopes into my hands. Do you know what this is? She demanded. The HOA had tacked on fees. Late fees, processing fees, administrative fees. By their math, that $75 had already ballooned into over $400. And the letter warned that if not paid within 7 days, legal remedies would be pursued. I laughed a short, bitter sound. They're padding numbers like a loan shark. But deep down, unease was setting in. I'd heard whispers about Karen's appetite for blood. The Johnsons down the street once owed a fine for unauthorized landscaping. Apparently their choice of mulch was non-conforming. They thought it would go away. It didn't. Within 6 months they had a lien on their home. They moved out a year later, their porch lights still on when the moving truck pulled away. Karen had made an example of them. And now she was circling me like her next prize. The breaking point came at the monthly HOA meeting. I hadn't planned to attend, but a neighbor tipped me off. Karen's putting your fine on the agenda. You might want to hear this. I walked in late just as she was standing at the front with her beloved clipboard, reading aloud from what sounded like a prepared speech. Repeated non-compliance, she declared, threatens the integrity of this community. If members believe they can simply ignore the rules, the entire fabric of our neighborhood will unravel. Her eyes flicked to me sharp, triumphant. This homeowner, she said, practically spitting the word, has ignored notices, phone calls, and certified letters. He has demonstrated a pattern of disregard for our standards. Therefore, I move that the board pursue foreclosure proceedings to recover the outstanding balance. Gasps rippled through the room. Foreclosure, over $75 plus some made-up fees. Even the board members shifted uncomfortably. I stood. Are you serious? This is insane. I forgot to take down a decoration. That's it. And you want to steal my house over it. Karen's smile was thin and smug. Rules are rules. Perhaps if you'd respected them, we wouldn't be here. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it didn't matter. Enough timid nods sealed the deal. As I left the meeting, one of my neighbors whispered, "I'm sorry, man. Nobody can stop her." But that was where they were wrong. Karen thought she had me cornered. She thought she was David toppling Goliath with her little clipboard. But what she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I had an ace up my sleeve. A man who had built his career dismantling tyrants, crooks, and corporate bullies. My father. And when I finally told him what was happening, he didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it as petty. He just leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said with a voice so calm, it chilled me, "They want a war, then we'll give them one." If there's one thing I've learned about people like Karen, it's this: give them a little power and they'll act like they've been crowned Queen of England. That $75 fine wasn't just about decorations, it was her ticket to parade me around as the neighborhood villain, a shiny example of what happens when you don't bow down to the throne. I didn't realize how deep her claws had sunk into the HOA board until I sat through another meeting. Imagine a room full of adults, grown men and women with jobs, families, and mortgages, sitting in metal folding chairs like schoolchildren, while Karen lectured them about community harmony. It was surreal, like watching a bad high school play where everyone forgot they had the right to walk off stage. That night she opened with a slideshow. Yes, a slideshow. Pictures of my house with arrows pointing at my porch zoomed in on the reindeer, a date stamp plastered in the corner like evidence from a crime scene. She clicked through each slide with the smug rhythm of a prosecutor revealing the murder weapon. This, she said, stabbing a laser pointer at the screen, is not just one man's negligence. It is habitual non-compliance. Habitual, I wanted to laugh. I had one late Christmas decoration, not a meth lab in the basement. But the way she said it, you'd think I'd been running an illegal casino from my garage. She whipped around to face the board. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to spread. If we let one person ignore the rules soon, everyone will think the HOA is powerless. The board shifted in their seats. Some of them nodded, but their eyes darted nervously toward me. They weren't blind, they knew this was overkill. But Karen had a way of turning disagreement into treason. One man cleared his throat. Isn't foreclosure a little extreme? Couldn't we just... Karen cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. Extreme? What's extreme is letting our neighborhood values erode because one homeowner thinks he's above the law. Foreclosure is not just justified, it's necessary. Her voice rose in pitch with each word like a preacher delivering a sermon, and as ridiculous as it was, the room started to sway with her rhythm. That's Karen's power, not logic, not fairness, but intimidation wrapped in passion. When the vote came, the board folded faster than a cheap lawn chair. The motion passed, foreclosure proceedings authorized. It was official. Over $75, my home, the place where I raised my kids, grilled burgers on the weekend, and painted the nursery walls years ago, was now a pawn in Karen's personal crusade. I walked out of that meeting with my fists clenched so tight, my nails dug crescents into my palms. Neighbors avoided my eyes. A few gave sympathetic nods, but no one dared speak up. That was Karen's true victory, not the foreclosure, but the silence she bred in everyone around her. The days that followed felt like living under siege. I'd catch her SUV parked at the corner, engine idling as if she was surveilling me. Letters piled up in my mailbox, each thicker than the last, crammed with threats of legal action and administrative fees. One Saturday morning, as I raked leaves in the yard, she strutted up the sidewalk. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose, that lemon-sucking expression etched across her face. "You should start packing," she said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Once the process starts, it moves quickly." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Over $75, she smirked. "Rules are rules. Maybe next time you'll think twice before ignoring the HOA." And just like that, she turned on her heel and marched off, heels clicking against the pavement like a gavel striking doom. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about money. She wanted me humiliated. She wanted me gone, a cautionary tale whispered about at block parties. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that I wasn't alone. I remember driving to my father's house that night. My hands shook on the steering wheel, anger bubbling under my skin. I walked into his study, where he sat in his leather chair, stacks of legal briefs around him, like a fortress. The man had built his career, dismantling corporate empires, exposing corrupt officials, and winning cases that other lawyers wouldn't dare touch. I dropped the foreclosure letter onto his desk. "Dad, they're taking my house." "Over this." He read it slowly, his face unreadable. When he finally looked up, his eyes were steel. $75, he asked. "Yeah. Plus fees they invented out of thin air. She wants me gone." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. For a long moment he said nothing. Then a smile curled across his lips, a cold, sharp smile that made even me shiver. "Good," he said. "They've made a mistake." "What do you mean?" "They've picked a fight with the wrong family. And I'm going to show them exactly what happens when you abuse the law." In that moment, the weight on my chest lifted. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope. Because I knew something Karen didn't. My father wasn't just a lawyer. He was the lawyer. The one people whispered about. The one judges respected and opposing counsel feared. Karen thought she had the power. She thought she'd won. But she was about to learn a very expensive lesson. There are moments in life you never forget. Birthdays, weddings, the first time your kid calls you dad. And then there are the darker ones, the gut-wrenching moments that stay burned into your memory like a scar. For me, one of those moments came in the form of a bright orange notice taped to my front door. I remember pulling into the driveway after a long day, my briefcase tossed onto the passenger seat, my mind already halfway inside to dinner and a glass of bourbon. But then I saw it flapping in the wind, taped right across my front door, screaming in bold letters, "Foreclosure notice." My stomach dropped. I froze in the driveway, keys still in hand, as if moving any closer would make it real. The neighbors' curtains twitched. I could feel their eyes on me, watching the spectacle Karen had orchestrated. I ripped the paper down, scanned the text, and felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just another threat. This was official. Sheriff's office, seal case, number, dates, signatures. Karen had pushed it through. The house I worked for, the home where my children grew up, was now tangled in the legal machinery of foreclosure. I walked inside like a ghost. My wife was at the kitchen table sorting mail. She looked up, saw the paper in my hand, and went pale. "No," she whispered. "No, they can't." But they could, and they had. The next few days were a blur of humiliation. A county officer came by to inspect the property. Karen made sure she was there when he arrived, standing smugly on the sidewalk with her arms crossed like a queen surveying her conquered territory. When I confronted her, she didn't even bother to hide her delight. "You should have just paid the fine," she said, her lips curling into that infuriating smirk. "Now the process has started. Nothing you can do about it." "Over $75, I snapped. "This is insane." She shrugged. "Rules are rules." That phrase again like a knife she enjoyed twisting. The humiliation wasn't just about losing the house. It was about the whispers. Neighbors I'd barbecued with, chatted with at the mailbox, suddenly avoided me. They weren't cruel, but they were scared. Nobody wanted to be the next target. If Karen could take me down, what chance did they have? I caught snippets of conversation at the grocery store, in the cul-de-sac, even at church. "Did you hear he's losing the house? Over a fine? Can you believe it? Better keep our lawns trimmed." The stress at home was unbearable. My wife was furious at Karen at the HOA, at me for not taking it seriously enough in the beginning. My kids asked if we'd have to move. I tried to reassure them, but the words tasted like lies. One night I sat in the living room surrounded by half-packed boxes. The orange notice lay on the coffee table like a curse. I poured myself a drink, stared at the walls I'd painted with my own hands, and felt the weight of defeat pressing down. For the first time, I thought maybe Karen had won, but that was before I called my father. He came over the next morning, sharp as ever in his tailored suit, even though it was a Saturday. He walked through the house slowly, taking it all in his jaw set. Finally, he stopped in front of the foreclosure notice, picked it up, and read it word for word. When he finished, he turned to me. "They actually did it," he said softly. Then his eyes hardened. "Good. That makes it easier." I frowned. "Easier?" He nodded. "They've overplayed their hand. A foreclosure over $75, with fabricated fees piled on top. That's abuse of power. That's illegal. And now it's on record." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. My father wasn't just calm, he was energized. I'd seen that look before, back when he dismantled a corrupt city council in court, leaving their lawyers sweating through their suits. It was the look of a man sharpening his knives. Still, I couldn't shake the fear. "Dad, what if they win? What if we actually lose the house?" He clapped a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, steady, like an anchor. "Son, they've just handed me the easiest case of my career. By the time I'm finished, Karen and her board won't just lose this fight, they'll wish they'd never started it." That night, I slept for the first time in weeks. Not because the problem was gone, but because I knew Karen had finally picked on the wrong family. She wanted to make an example out of me. She wanted to humiliate me, drag me through the mud, and take my home as a trophy. But she was about to learn that sometimes the law isn't on the side of the loudest voice or the pettiest tyrant. Sometimes it belongs to the man who knows it inside and out. The man she didn't know was my father. Karen thought she'd broken me. She thought the foreclosure notice was the end of the story. But in reality, it was just the beginning. I've always known my father was a force of nature. Growing up, I saw it in flashes, like the time he cross-examined a corrupt contractor at a city hearing until the man practically confessed on the spot. Or when he defended a neighbor from an unfair insurance denial and left the company begging for a settlement. To me, he was just Dad. To everyone else, he was a man you didn't want to face across a courtroom. But I'd never seen him like this, laser-focused, coldly amused like a lion who just spotted an injured gazelle. He spread the foreclosure notice across my kitchen table, flattening it with his palm. "They're sloppy," he said, his eyes scanning every line. "They've added fees that don't exist in the bylaws. They skipped required steps in the collection process. And this language," he tapped the paper sharply, "is a violation of state statute." I blinked. "So, they screwed up." He chuckled a low sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Son, they didn't just screw up. They've built me a ladder, handed me a torch, and begged me to climb up and burn their house down." There was a certain comfort in hearing that, but I still couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. Karen thinks she's untouchable. The board backs her up no matter what she says. "Boards are easy," Dad said, already scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. "Half of them don't understand the rules they're supposed to enforce. The other half are too cowardly to stand up to someone loud. Once they realize she's exposed them to liability, they'll turn on her faster than you can say, 'special assessment.'" His confidence was almost frightening. Over the next week, I got a front row seat to what it meant to have a feared lawyer as your father. He didn't just draft a letter, he orchestrated a campaign. Certified notices went out citing case law so dense, I had to Google every other word. Requests for documents landed on the HOA's doorstep demanding receipts, bylaws, and meeting minutes. Every piece of correspondence was a trap carefully worded to corner them no matter how they responded. Karen, of course, tried to bluff her way through. She sent back smug replies dripping with false confidence. "We are within our rights. Failure to comply will only increase consequences." But you could sense the cracks. She stopped CCing the entire board, her letters grew shorter, and once she even misspelled foreclosure. For someone obsessed with control, that kind of slip meant pressure was mounting. At dinner one night, my dad explained it plainly. "Karen's problem isn't that she's tough, it's that she's arrogant. She doesn't know the law, she just knows how to scare people who don't. But she picked the wrong family this time." I laughed, but it wasn't the nervous laugh I'd given weeks earlier. This time it was real. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like we were the hunters. Neighbors began to notice the shift too. One evening, while I was taking the trash to the curb, Jim from next door wandered over. He glanced around nervously, then leaned in. "I heard she got a letter from your dad." She looked rattled. "Good," I said simply. And for the first time, I was the one smirking. Karen didn't retreat quietly, though. If anything, she doubled down. She scheduled another HOA meeting, determined to put me on display again. That night, the room was tense. Karen launched into her usual performance, waving papers and declaring I was a chronic rule breaker. But then something happened that stunned everyone. My father stood up. Now you have to picture this. My dad isn't flashy. He doesn't raise his voice. But when he speaks, people listen. His presence fills a room without needing to shout. And that night, he filled that shabby HOA meeting hall like it was the Supreme Court. He calmly introduced himself, laid out his credentials, and then, like a surgeon with a scalpel, began dismantling Karen's claims one by one. He cited bylaws she had ignored, pointed out procedural errors, and quoted state law that invalidated half her threats. Every sentence was precise, every fact irrefutable. Karen tried to interrupt, of course. "This is an HOA matter," she barked. "You don't even live here." Dad didn't even flinch. He just adjusted his glasses and said, "I represent my son. And unlike you, I actually know what the law says." The room went dead silent. By the time he finished, Karen was red-faced and stammering the board members, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, people were looking at her, not with fear, but with doubt. That night, as we drove home, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: pride. Pride in my father, pride in my family, pride in finally standing up to the bully who had turned our lives upside down. Karen thought the foreclosure notice was the final nail in my coffin, But thanks to my dad, it was just the first swing of the hammer aimed squarely back at her, and the sound of that hammer was about to echo all the way to court. If Karen thought posting a foreclosure notice on my door was her knockout punch, she had no idea what was coming. My father wasn't the type to throw a single jab. He came at opponents with a full-blown legal hurricane. And Karen, bless her power-hungry heart, was about to find out what it felt like to be caught in the middle. The first salvo came in the form of a 40-page motion. Not a letter, not a complaint. A full motion to dismiss the foreclosure, citing violations of state homeowner protection statutes, illegal fee stacking, and improper notice procedures. I remember the look on the courier's face when he delivered it to Karen's doorstep, like he was carrying a live grenade. By Monday morning, the entire board had received copies. One neighbor told me Karen was pacing her porch with the motion in hand, yelling into her phone, her face as red as her favorite blazer. But my dad wasn't done. He followed up with discovery requests, every financial record, every bylaw, every amendment the HOA had passed in the last 10 years. He demanded meeting minutes, board correspondence, even receipts for landscaping expenses. If they want to abuse the law, he told me, we'll drag every skeleton out of their closet. Karen tried to play tough at first. She sent back one of her classic smug letters dripping with faux authority. The HOA does not respond to intimidation tactics. Dad just smirked. Good. That means she's rattled. And she was. I started to notice it in little ways. Her SUV didn't prowl past my house quite as often. The smug grin she wore at board meetings was replaced with tight lips and darting eyes. Neighbors whispered that she'd been calling emergency sessions of the board, frantically trying to rally support. But with each legal filing my father dropped, her grip weakened. See, Karen's entire reign was built on fear, on the assumption that nobody would dare push back. But now that someone was pushing back with the force of a seasoned lawyer behind him, people started to see the cracks. At the grocery store, Jim sidled up to me in the cereal aisle. I heard she had to hire an attorney, he whispered, almost giddy. Costs are already in the thousands. Thousands, I asked. He nodded. And that's just the retainer. Your dad's paperwork is burying them. It was delicious. The same HOA that fined me $75 for a reindeer was now bleeding money, all thanks to their president's crusade. Karen, of course, wasn't about to admit defeat. She doubled down, insisting at the next meeting that the HOA was within its rights and that this was just a baseless intimidation attempt. But her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and the board members sitting beside her looked less like loyal allies and more like hostages waiting for rescue. My father kept the pressure relentless. He didn't just challenge the foreclosure, he filed counterclaims. Harassment, abuse of process, violation of state, consumer protection laws. Each filing was another nail in Karen's coffin, each one demanding time, money, and attention she didn't have. The best part, he made sure every motion was public record. Neighbors began to whisper not about me, but about her. Did you hear? She's being sued. I think the HOA's in trouble. Karen's finally getting what she deserves. The tide was turning. At home, the atmosphere shifted too. My wife, who'd been furious and frightened weeks earlier, started smiling again. Your dad's a machine, she said one night, flipping through one of his motions. I don't understand half of this, but it looks terrifying. It is, I told her with a grin, at least if you're on the wrong side of it. Even my kids picked up on the change. My daughter whispered to her brother one night, Grandpa's like a superhero. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't go down quietly. Bullies rarely do. She tried stalling, refusing to turn over documents, hoping delays would break our momentum, but Dad anticipated every trick. Each delay tactic only gave him another chance to file sanctions to expose her defiance to the court. Then came the day she slipped. Buried in the HOA's financial records finally produced under court order, Dad found something ugly. Misused funds. Money that was supposed to maintain the community pool had instead been funneled into administrative costs. The signatures pointed straight back to Karen. When Dad showed me, I nearly dropped the paper. She stole from the HOA. Not yet proven, he said carefully, though his eyes gleamed. But this raises questions. And questions like these make judges very curious. The next filing didn't just attack the foreclosure, it accused Karen and the HOA of financial mismanagement. Suddenly, this wasn't about me anymore. It was about every homeowner in the community, every dollar of dues they'd ever paid. That night, as I sat on my porch with a beer in hand, Jim wandered over again. You've got the whole neighborhood rooting for you now, he said. People are sick of her. If she goes down, maybe we'll finally get our community back. I smiled, watching Karen's house across the street, her blinds drawn tight. For weeks, she'd strutted around like a queen, but now she looked more like a prisoner in her own castle. The legal storm was only getting started, but already I could feel the balance shifting. For the first time since this nightmare began, the fear wasn't on my side of the street, it was on hers. The courthouse was nothing fancy, just a squat building with beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights. But that morning as I walked through its doors, it might as well have been the stage for the greatest drama of my life. The stakes weren't just my house. It was my dignity, my sanity, and my chance to prove that tyrants don't always win. Karen arrived in full regalia, of course. Red blazer, pressed pearls, shining hair, stiff with hairspray. She marched up the courthouse steps like she was entering a royal coronation, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She carried a thick binder tucked under her arm, probably stuffed with violation slips and passive-aggressive emails, her holy scriptures of neighborhood control. I watched from across the plaza, my father at my side. He looked calm, almost bored, as if this was just another Tuesday. But there was something in the way he adjusted his tie, the way his eyes flicked toward Karen with surgical coldness, that told me he was ready. Inside, we took our seats. The judge entered, a tall man with salt and pepper hair who clearly had no patience for nonsense. He gave us all a curt nod before glancing at the docket. Case number 4273. Homeowners Association versus he paused, looking at me, Mr. Thompson. Karen leapt to her feet, practically glowing. Your Honor, she began, voice dripping with fake professionalism, this is a clear case of habitual noncompliance. This homeowner has repeatedly defied our rules, ignored fines, and disrupted the harmony of our community. We are here to enforce the bylaws and proceed with foreclosure. She sounded rehearsed, every word dripping with the smug certainty of someone who believed she had already won. She even flashed a smile at me across the room, a silent gotcha. Then my father stood. Your Honor, he said calmly, his voice rich and steady, this is not a case of noncompliance. This is a case of abuse. Abuse of power, abuse of process, and abuse of the very laws this association claims to uphold. And just like that, the temperature in the room shifted. He began his attack methodically, like a surgeon cutting into diseased tissue. First, he dismantled the original fine. He cited the exact HOA bylaw that allowed a reasonable grace period for holiday decorations, something Karen had ignored. He produced photographs of other houses, neighbors, with lights still up well past mine that had never been fined. Selective enforcement, he called it. Discrimination by discretion. Karen's smile wavered. Then he moved to the fees. He showed line by line how the HOA had invented charges not authorized by the governing documents. Administrative fees. Late fees stacked on late fees. He called it a pyramid of nonsense built on $75. The judge actually smirked at that. Karen shifted in her seat, her binder clutched tighter, and then the coup de grace dad revealed the financial discrepancies. He laid out receipts showing HOA funds, misused checks signed under Karen's name. He didn't accuse her of theft outright, he didn't have to. He simply presented the documents and asked, how does the pool maintenance fund end up paying for catered luncheons at a country club? The courtroom buzzed. Even the board members beside Karen looked blindsided. Karen tried to fight back. She stood, voice rising. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. We are here because this homeowner refused to pay his fine. Dad didn't even look at her. He simply addressed the judge. Irrelevant, Your Honor, it goes directly to the credibility and intent of the party bringing this action. This is not about a fine. This is about a president abusing her position to intimidate homeowners and line her pockets. The judge's eyes narrowed at Karen. Do you have an explanation for these expenditures, Miss Jenkins? For the first time since this nightmare began, Karen faltered. She stammered, flipping through her binder pages, rustling like panic. It was board approved. I don't have those documents with me. Dad leaned forward, his voice cool, convenient. The judge banged his gavel lightly. Miss Jenkins, I suggest you answer directly. This court does not tolerate obfuscation. By now, Karen was sweating. Her perfect hair looked brittle under the fluorescent lights. Her red blazer, once a symbol of dominance, now looked more like a warning flare sinking into the sea. I sat back, heart pounding, a grin tugging at my lips. For weeks I'd felt like prey. But here in this room, watching Karen unravel under my father's precision strikes, I realized the roles had reversed. Dad closed with a line that should have been engraved in stone. Your Honor, this foreclosure attempt is not only unjust, it's unlawful. My client's rights have been trampled, his reputation smeared, and his property threatened over a $75 fine that never should have existed in the first place. I ask that you not only dismiss this foreclosure, but hold the association accountable for their reckless actions. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. He glanced at Karen, who sat frozen, her face pale, then back at my father. Finally, he said, "I'll take this under advisement. But I will say this, I find the evidence presented today deeply troubling." Bang of the gavel. Adjourned. Karen stormed out of the courtroom, binder clutched to her chest, her board members trailing behind like rats deserting a sinking ship. My father calmly packed his briefcase, as if he'd just wrapped up a casual Tuesday morning meeting. Outside neighbors who had come to watch the spectacle approached me. They clapped me on the back, whispered, "She's finished, and your dad's incredible." For the first time in months, I walked through the parking lot with my head held high. The war wasn't over, the verdict hadn't been delivered yet. But the battle was ours. And Karen knew it. When Judgment Day finally came, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread like wildfire across the neighborhood. Folks who had once hidden behind their curtains now sat shoulder to shoulder on the benches, eager to see whether the iron-fisted president of our HOA would stand or fall. You could feel the buzz of anticipation in the air. Karen walked in first, binder clutched tight against her chest. But she wasn't the same smug queen who'd taped foreclosure papers to my door weeks earlier. Her blazer was wrinkled, her hair lacked its usual perfect shellac, and the confident click of her heels sounded more like the shuffle of someone walking to the gallows. I followed with my father, steady as always, briefcase in hand, expression unreadable. To the crowd, he might have looked calm. To me, he looked like a man who already knew the ending of the story. The judge wasted no time. This court has reviewed the filings, the evidence, and the testimony presented. What I have seen troubles me deeply. He flipped through his notes, then fixed his eyes squarely on Karen. The attempt to foreclose on Mr. Thompson's home was not only excessive, but riddled with procedural violations. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge continued, his tone sharp as a blade. Selective enforcement of rules, fabricated fees, and mismanagement of HOA funds have been documented. This is unacceptable. The foreclosure is hereby dismissed, effective immediately. It felt like a weight lifted off my chest. My home was safe. The nightmare was over, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, turning to Karen, this court orders the HOA to pay Mr. Thompson's legal fees in full. And given the evidence of financial mismanagement, I am referring this matter to the State Attorney General for further investigation. Gasps filled the courtroom. Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no sound came out, just a faint wheeze. And then it happened. The woman who had strutted around our neighborhood like a dictator who had bullied, fined, and threatened us all broke, right there in front of everyone. Her hands trembled, her eyes darted wildly, and tears welled up as she sank into her chair. This isn't fair," she whispered, though the words sounded more like a child's tantrum than the command of a leader. My father leaned toward me, voice low but firm. "Justice isn't about what feels fair, son. It's about what's right." The board members beside Karen didn't even try to defend her. One quietly slid his chair back, staring at the floor. Another shook his head, muttering under his breath. They knew their queen had fallen, and they weren't about to go down with her. When the gavel struck to close the session, the room erupted. Neighbors whispered, some openly grinned, others clapped me on the back as I stood. One woman leaned close and said, "Thank you. We've all been waiting for this." Karen, meanwhile, stumbled out of the courtroom like a marionette with cut strings. Her binder slipped from her arms, papers spilling across the floor. No one rushed to help her. She was alone. The fallout came fast. Within days, word spread that several board members had resigned. Homeowners demanded a special election, and without Karen's chokehold, the board crumbled. Meetings that were once tense lectures turned into open forums. Neighbors who had lived in fear started laughing again, kids rode bikes without side-eyeing the president's SUV, and front yards blossomed with flowers of every imaginable color. And Karen, she vanished. Rumor had it she moved in with her sister across town, too humiliated to show her face in our neighborhood. The for sale sign went up on her house, and for the first time, people smiled when they passed it. Not cruel smiles, relieved ones. Smiles of freedom. One evening, I sat on my porch with a beer in hand, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. Jim strolled over, grinning ear to ear. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. "Karen gone. The HOA actually normal again." "Neither did I admitted. He chuckled. "Your dad should run for president. He'd get every vote." I laughed, shaking my head. "He doesn't need the title. He already made his point." Later that night, Dad came by. We sat in the living room, surrounded by walls that for a while I thought I'd lose. He raised his glass. "To standing up," he said. "To standing up," I echoed. The victory wasn't just about me keeping my home. It was about proving that bullies, no matter how loud or smug, eventually meet their match. Karen's downfall wasn't just my win, it was the neighborhood's. For weeks, I'd felt powerless, humiliated, and cornered. But now, watching my kids run through the yard without worry, seeing my wife smile again, hearing neighbors laugh freely, I realized something important. Sometimes all it takes is one person to fight back to free everyone else. And that fight had finally broken the Queen of Fines. The weeks after the trial felt like stepping into a brand new neighborhood. For the first time since Karen had clawed her way into power, there was no SUV prowling down the street at odd hours, no clipboard tapping against her chest, no angry letters tucked into mailboxes. The silence was almost shocking, but in the best way possible. Neighbors started coming out again. The Johnsons, who once had their porch lights turned off like they were living in witness protection, began hosting barbecues. Kids rode their bikes without glancing over their shoulders. Lawns sprouted with flowers in every possible shade, red, yellow, purple, none of which matched any approved palette. And nobody cared. The neighborhood finally felt alive again. As for me, I still remember the first Saturday after the ruling. I woke up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The air felt lighter. My home stood proudly behind me, safe, untouchable. I'd almost lost it over $75, but now it felt more valuable than ever. I saw Jim waving from across the street. He strolled over, carrying a box of donuts. "Peace offering," he said with a grin. "You fought for all of us. Least I can do is share some sugar." We sat on my porch steps, sipping coffee and tearing into powdered donuts. He told me how neighbors were already organizing a petition to formally remove Karen from the HOA records. "We don't just want her gone, we want her erased," he said. I laughed. "History books will still remember her." "Yeah," he said, smirking, "as the woman who tried to foreclose a house over a reindeer and got buried by a lawyer." Speaking of which, my father didn't gloat. That wasn't his style. But I could see the satisfaction in his eyes when we celebrated quietly at my dining table one evening. He raised a glass of bourbon, the amber light reflecting off the rim. "Son," he said, "this wasn't just about a house. It was about teaching people like her a lesson. You stand up to tyranny, big or small, because if you don't, it grows." His words stuck with me. Karen's downfall didn't just protect me. It sent a message to every HOA president, every petty tyrant who thought a clipboard and a rulebook gave them divine right over other people's lives. Power unchecked always corrupts, and Karen had been the living proof. The official fallout was brutal for her. State investigators opened an inquiry into the financial mismanagement my dad uncovered. Rumors swirled of fines, penalties, and potential criminal charges. Her house went on the market within weeks, a for sale sign, swaying in the breeze where once she'd stood like a guard tower. No one in the neighborhood mourned her absence. If anything, the day the moving truck came felt like a holiday. People waved from their lawns. Someone popped open champagne. The Johnson kids even chalked BYE Karen on the sidewalk. Me, I just stood on my porch, arms folded, watching quietly as the truck pulled away. There was no need to shout, no need to rub it in. The silence of her departure was victory enough. Now, months later, my life has returned to normal. Better than normal, even. I still pay my HOA dues, but under new leadership, they actually go where they're supposed to. The new president is a soft-spoken retiree who cares more about planting community gardens than writing violation slips. Imagine that an HOA that works for people instead of against them. Sometimes I walk past Karen's old house and wonder what she thinks when she looks back. Does she regret it, or is she still convinced she was right? The hero of her own story. I'll never know. What I do know is this: she's gone and I'm still here. My family's safe. My home is mine. And the neighborhood is stronger for it. All because a $75 fine lit the fuse that Karen never should have touched. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: small battles matter. It wasn't about a reindeer on my lawn or a $75 fine. It was about standing up to someone who thought power gave them the right to trample others. And that lesson applies far beyond HOAs. Bullies come in many forms: a boss who exploits a neighbor, who intimidates a friend, who manipulates. They thrive when people stay quiet. They grow stronger when fear keeps us from speaking up. But the moment someone draws a line, the moment someone says, enough, their power begins to crumble. I almost lost my home, but I gained something bigger: the reminder that family has your back and that justice, though slow, does come when you fight for it. Watching my dad dismantle Karen's empire taught me that knowledge, persistence, and courage are the sharpest weapons we have. So if you're facing your own Karen, whether in a neighborhood, a workplace, or even within your own circle, remember you are not powerless. Stand your ground, speak the truth, protect what's yours. And hey, if this story resonated with you, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and if you've ever had to face down a bully in your own life. And don't forget to subscribe, because around here the drama never really ends.